Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's good to see y'all. Let me get turned to the right place here. Luke chapter 22. So when we left off last week, Jesus has left the temple. He has talked about the destruction of the temple, which occurs in AD 70. And most likely he goes back out to stay in the countryside where he was. And then the next day he enters back into the city to prepare for the Passover feast. Chapter 22 begins with Judas's betrayal of Jesus. I've struggled with this for years because some of this just doesn't make sense to me, and I've done a lot of reading and study on it. And I have not been able to come up with all the answers, which is probably okay. Because we're told what we need to know, but curiosity kills, right? So, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. The chief priests and scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, for they were afraid of the people." Now, keep that phrase in mind, because if we get far enough this morning, Luke kind of refers back to this idea of fear again. But in this case, why were the Jews afraid of the people? Well, I think in this case it was because it was the Passover. And they were afraid that if they did what they wanted to do, which ultimately they do, and it actually happens, that a great tumult has arisen, and the people, there's an uproar among the people. Eventually they put Christ to death. They know where this is leading, or where it will lead. And they're afraid to stir the people up during the Passover feast. And I think that's what he's saying there. That's my opinion. In verse 3 says, and Satan, what's your translation say? Okay. Isn't that what we just talked about a few minutes ago? Judas, who was one of the 12, verse 3, he belonged to the number of the 12. Now, I think that's important. Was Judas an apostle? Absolutely. Was he one of the 12? Was he saved? Well, sure he was. Just as we talked about a few minutes ago. If Judas would have been obedient and faithful to the Lord, from that point, if he hadn't allowed Satan to enter him, and he had remained faithful to the Lord, would he have had eternal life? Well, sure he would. But what's he do? He gives Satan more power than Satan deserves. He allows Satan to enter him. And what happens when we allow Satan to enter us? This is the application I want to make here. Go ahead, Richie.
His will provides.
Say that again.
His will provides.
Okay, so Satan's will prevails over the will of God in our lives when we let him in. Okay? And what do we do?
Satan has a tendency to work on what we're tempted.
Mm-hmm.
And we give in to that. When Satan enters into it, we give in to whatever that temptation is, whatever he's going about like a roaring lion trying to
Okay.
eat us up. Talks here another verse to do, verse 5, I'll be giving you money. John talks
Right.
about how to keep, how to keep the thief.
Right.
This
And
is going to be played into
It will, and we're going to get back to that in a second. Rick, you had a thought, or somebody else?
When we allow Satan to enter in, that's when he gets inside and can really see what's inside.
Okay.
When he breaks into the house, he may not know what he's going to pick up until he gets inside.
Well, that's a good point. The thief doesn't always know what he won't take until they get inside the house and see what's there. That's a great point. Real quick, keep your finger there. Look back at Luke chapter 4. And it's been a while since we were in Luke 4. But remember, this is Luke's count of the temptation of Christ in the wilderness, right? Satan comes to the Lord. The Lord, verse 1, is led around by the Spirit in the wilderness, and Satan comes to him and tempts him for 40 days. In verse 13, it says, when the devil had finished every temptation. Now, sometimes we get caught up in the three. And three are recorded here for us because I believe they represent the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. But verse 13 would indicate that there was more than three temptations in the wilderness. He continually tempted the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end of every temptation, Satan did what? He left. Is Satan omnipresent? He leaves until an opportune time. Back to our text, chapter 22, verse 3. And Satan entered. He sought an opportune time, and here's his opportunity. He knows lust of the flesh. He probably knows, if John knows, others know that he's a thief. Satan sees an opportunity, and he seizes on that opportunity. But notice this, verse 4. Satan entered, and Judas, what'd Judas do? He left, he went. When we let Satan into our lives, what do we do to Christ? We leave him. You can't have both of them inside you at the same time. And if you open up your heart to Satan, you're leaving the Lord. And that's exactly what Judas does here. He opens his heart and he leaves. If we don't want to leave Christ, does Christ go anywhere? He's always where he always is. Nothing can separate me from his love. But what can I do? I can walk away. I can let Satan into my heart and I can walk away. So Judas goes away. He went away and discussed with the chief priests and the officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad. And they agreed to give him money. As we go through here, and this is something that I will continue to remind ourselves of, and that is, we need to be careful of basing doctrine and teaching and things on the English translations. All right? God gave us words to communicate to us his will, to know what happened, that we need, the things we need to know. But he conveyed those words in Greek, Koine Greek, the common Greek language of the day. There's a big difference between Koine Greek and English. And so when you start looking at certain things in the English translation and wrapping teaching around the English translation, a lot of times we get ourselves in trouble. So we got to be careful there.
When you say get in trouble, do you think, personally, I've always been under the opinion like, well, hey, if God's powerful enough to preserve his word throughout the centuries, if I have what I feel to be a halfway accurate, or not halfway, but most accurate, a hands-on translation, you use the term get in trouble.
Yes.
Get in trouble, does it go to hell get in trouble?
It can.
So you think that if all someone had the King James Version of the Bible and had all their doctrine around it, they would go to hell?
They can. There have been those who have. The Calvinists have.
So you're saying without the Greek?
Yes. I had a guy ask me years ago, I mentioned there was a particular Greek word, and after Bible class he said, you don't need to know Greek to go to heaven. I said, no, but somebody did. Because God communicated to us, to the apostles, how? And Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3, the things that I received by inspiration from God, I wrote so that when you read, you can understand. Well, what words did he write those in? We don't have originals, but we have copies of the originals. Many copies of the originals that scholars have went through and compared and been able to very accurately put together what the original would have said.
I guess to me, I think the problem is God has preserved it in enough form for us to be saved to an English translation, and the problem is God might not be able to preserve it to a...
My point is that there's no English translation that's perfect. And there are things in every translation that are mistranslated by the translator that can be misconstrued, and doctrine can be wrapped around those things that can cost people their souls.
It's just a matter of time.
Now, can you read the scripture in the English and know what you need to know to go to heaven? Absolutely. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying that there are translations that lead to error.
You are saying that without the Greek, you can't
Well,
have it.
no, you couldn't.
Without us having possession of the Greek, why we have the Greek?
Well, we couldn't have the English without the Greek. Because that's how it was given.
But if we have just the English, wrote that.
I don't know if I'm following. Again, the point is we couldn't have the English without the Greek. If God would have gave us the English translation, this English translation is not inspired. The Greek was inspired. The original was inspired. This isn't inspired.
But you're saying that we have to have a copy of the original.
Yes.
Sales in order to go there.
Somebody had to.
Someone has to.
Correct.
We have to do ourselves.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
No, I'm saying that in order for us to have a translation, and like you said, an accurate translation, we have to have somebody who knows the Greek who was able to translate it for us. Without the translation, unless you know Greek, you couldn't know what God's will was. All right, so there are some translations that use the word predestined. Okay? The original Greek word carries with it the idea of God's knowledge about the plan that would lead to salvation. But there are people who have taken the English word predestined and wrapped predestination and the theology of predestination around it. And they have mistranslated what is being said there. If they understood what the Greek language was, does that make sense? Absolutely, you can. Proof texting is another subject, and it can be dangerous to proof text. But yeah, okay. But we'll come back to that again later too, because I think there's another example of that here in a few moments. But the point here is in verse 5. Chase that around. Try to get back to this. They were glad and they agreed. The word here means they mutually agreed. Judas and they entered into a pact with one another. Okay? They entered into this mutual agreement for payment and for something in return for the payment. And he consented and began seeking an opportunity to betray him to them apart from the crowd. Here's my question. Did they not know who Jesus was? Had he not on numerous occasions already been sought out after by these men? Had they not already on numerous occasions tried to take him by force, but were afraid of the people? And we think of the betrayal as we come to here later, we won't get to today. We think of the betrayal as the kiss in the garden. Is that what the betrayal was? Okay, but in what way did he betray Jesus?
When he let Satan in.
Oh, I'm sorry?
When he let Satan enter into him.
Okay. I think there can be a sense that he betrayed his faith and trust in the Lord.
Yes, sir.
And that's true. But what I'm asking, I think, here is, how did he betray Jesus to the Jewish people, to the chief priests and officers? How did he betray him to them? I'm sorry? Again, now my question is, okay, how is it that just kissing him and identifying him in the garden is a betrayal? Again, they would have known who he was. They had seen him on multiple occasions. I think that is the case, is why they went out at night in the garden and they did this. Because I think it was away from the crowd. It was a more private thing, that they could do it without causing an uproar at that moment in time. I still think there's more to it.
Was that kiss not Peter's denial to himself, where he had to do martyrdom. It was a physical
It was.
turning his back on Christ by doing that.
I think it is and I'm going to tell you what my opinion is here in a second. I think that is the quintessential moment where he gives him up. And it's almost like the point of no return, right? Turn back to Matthew 26. This is a little lengthy, but I want to read this whole thing here. Beginning in verse 57, Matthew 26. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priest and the whole council kept trying, here, verse 59. The chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. I think this is key. They had to have some reason, a capital offense, so that they could crucify him. And they were seeking out what? False testimony. But they did not, verse 60, they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward, and this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, where is Judas at this point? All right. So Jesus kept silent. And then finally Jesus says, you said it yourself. Well, I am the Son of God. You said it yourself, verse 64. In verse 65, he has blasphemed. He deserves to die, verse 66. And then in chapter 27, then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned. So Judas is somewhere about. Like Peter is sitting outside in the courtyard waiting, watching. Judas is somewhere nearby. But what we get here is Judas has not stepped forward to say anything. But what were they seeking? How many witnesses did they have to put him to death? And it says that initially they couldn't find two to agree. I think Judas went to him and said, I'll give him up and I'll be one of the witnesses. Well, they go out. Judas identifies him with the kiss. But when they go, Judas starts having what? He starts having second thoughts. And so they get there, and their key witness doesn't show up. So finally, two of these guys get their story straight, and they go, there we got two witnesses. And Judas, seeing that he was condemned, felt remorse, returned the 30 pieces of silver, and said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. So I think it was more than just the kiss. I think Judas went to him and said, I'll be a witness. That's my take on it. Now that may be, you can agree to disagree, that's fine. But I've always wondered that. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Did I just waste a bunch of time with that?
I'm going to pray to Christ. He blasphemed the Son of God.
Exactly.
That was hypocritical. Everything else on the part of Jesus was believed. You're an all here.
Right.
Hypocritical. Judas, the whole thing is just because Jesus was the Son of God.
Well, and we had the other text that says that when they went outside of the city, Jesus has that discussion with his disciples about tearing down this temple and raising it in 3 days and doing all this. Judas sees an opportunity to witness and get something out of it. Then he feels remorse. He doesn't go and testify. Jesus is condemned anyway. He really feels bad. He goes, tries to give back the money, and he goes out and hangs himself. In my mind, from studying this, that's how I think it played out. So what's the point? Yes. Make it an easy one.
Judas, they say, and the Bible says, that he was the honest.
Correct.
But there's more description of what happened to Judas. From his Adam's apple all the way down and split open. So I think he had head.
Oh, he might have. I was thinking that, and I'd have to go back and look at that again just to remind myself of the entirety of the narrative. It may have been that he had no help. He went out and hung himself, and he just hung there. And he hung there, and it says that he fell and he was split open. He burst open. So what happens to a dead animal, a dead human, when it lays out in the sun very long? It begins to swell up with the gases and everything. He hung there long enough that eventually either the rope break or the tree limb gave loose or whatever, and he falls, and when he does and he hits the ground, his body is split open and everything gushes out. That's my remembrance of the narrative. I'll go back and look at it again. So. Yes?
All right. Since Judas did all that kind of betrayal,
Mm-hmm.
then he asked for forgiveness for through the 3rd piece of the silver. Then do you realize that since he asked for forgiveness and he was sorrowful for what he did, do you feel like that he possibly made it
The judgment of that is left to God. My feeling is there's a difference between, and Paul refers to this in Corinthians, right? Paul talks about the difference between godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. Godly sorrow leads to repentance. It doesn't seem to me like Judas repented here. He was remorseful. He was sorry. But there wasn't a change. Could he have went back to Christ? I don't see anywhere here where he asks for forgiveness. He feels sorry, but he doesn't ask for forgiveness. He gives the money back, or tries to give the money back, but he doesn't ask for forgiveness. Peter denies him 3 times and is remorseful, goes out, cries bitterly, but later does what? He comes back to Jesus. He returns. If Judas would have went back to Jesus, fall on his knees and begged his forgiveness, would the Lord have forgiven him? Absolutely. Did he do that? I don't read that. I don't know.
It reads that he said, I have sinned. And he said that to the chief priest.
That's right. But that's all he says. Did he make it right with the Lord? I don't know. And I'm glad I'm not the judge of that. Right? Now, this I will say. I've heard a lot of people say that, I've heard people say suicide is the unforgivable sin. I don't believe that. I have a sense here that, can we be too hard on Judas here? Have you ever sinned and felt remorseful? I mean, have you ever sinned and just afterwards wept and cried and just felt defeated by your sin? What's your state of mind in that moment? I think, this is my opinion, think the vast majority of the people that commit suicide aren't in their right minds when they do it. And I don't know that they're held accountable for that sin. Now, they may be held accountable for others. Unrepented sin. But if something's done through an unstable mind, I don't think God holds us responsible for that. Not necessarily. There are a lot of people. Well, I mean, all death and all fallen nature of the world is a result of sin. Yeah. But I don't think, it's not like, well, if I am manic depressive, that's because of some sin that I've committed. Does that make sense? Oh, sure, absolutely it can. It absolutely can. I'm saying that sin can cause that, but that doesn't necessarily come because of sin in our lives. It's just like somebody that goes blind, or somebody that loses their hearing, or somebody that dies in a car accident doesn't mean that happened to them because of sin, or because of their sin. They're not being punished, right? Mental health disorders are not a punishment for sin.
Like an ultimate extreme, you might have somebody who's schizophrenic who thinks that demons are chasing them.
Right.
They run off the balcony and kill themselves.
Right. They're not responsible for that. And they're not schizophrenic because they committed fornication and God is punishing them with schizophrenia. That's not how that works, right? And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to be more gracious towards mental health issues. Because I'm telling you right now, I've had plenty of conversations. To some level or degree, every single one of us sitting here have mental health issues. Some of us greater than others. But now, is that a result? Does mental health issues in society, the world, is that because of sin? Absolutely. If Adam and Eve hadn't sinned in the garden, there would be no mental health issues. Right? We would live in a perfect world. But they did. They did sin. And they brought sin and death and the deterioration of the creation into existence because of sin. But I'm not schizophrenic. I'm not schizophrenic. Not that I know of. Colleen may differ. She thinks I'm crazy anyway. The little man in my head. This sounds like my dad. But I'm not schizophrenic because I lied on a test. And that caused me to have schizophrenia because God's punishing me some way. That's not how that works. Is that clear as mud for everybody? Sin can absolutely cause you to lose the proper function of your mind. What happens to the prodigal son? Eventually he comes to himself, which means he wasn't thinking straight. Why wasn't he thinking straight? Because of sin in his life. But I don't think he was schizophrenic. I don't think he was bipolar. Some of those things happen naturally. I guess that's the best way to say that. There is a natural imbalance in the body that causes mental illness. It's not the result of a personal sin. Does that make sense?
Not in certain words, but some of us say that it's not, all you're advising is to give leeway there to say, well, God has to be the ultimate judge. It's on
Correct.
He knows their state of mind at that moment.
Absolutely.
They could have been completely unaccountable. They could have been 100% accountable. But I wasn't able to be in their head at that moment.
Right.
God.
So I knew a guy growing up that was a carpet layer, one of the best carpet layers I've ever seen. He did some jobs for my dad. His son was in high school. He had a younger daughter, I think. The son came home, got off the bus one day, opened the garage door, and there his dad was hanging in the garage dead. He had some serious mental health issues that nobody really knew about. And I don't think he was right in the head. Bernie Madoff throws himself off a tower somewhere, whatever, because I got caught doing something I shouldn't have done, and takes the coward's way out. I think that's different. But I think the vast majority of people that commit suicide are probably dealing with some physical, psychological, mental health issue. Yes?
Do you think Judas is the coward way out?
Versus Peter?
Versus Peter?
Yeah.
Because they did say that he knew where he was going. He went to the people and said, I see.
Okay, so Phil brought up, right? He goes back to them and says, I sinned. That doesn't sound like somebody that's not aware, operating with he's not being chased by demons and out of his mind. He knows what he did was wrong.
It's what's the word?
Incontrovertible? Is that what you're trying to say? I don't know.
That everything that we have witnessed of Jewish doing, from stealing the money bag of or this event, from going to the priest to the grid of betrayal and kissing him, to up until that point is all sin, and he realized it, and I think we all agree that he's 100% accountable.
Right.
All that you're saying is, who the heck knows about that one sin when he finally hung himself in the tree, but he's got plenty of other.
That's right. That's right.
Now, we don't know. He could have, and I'll say this, he could have hung himself with a tree, and he could have realized after the road, myself,
Right.
I made a big mistake here. He could have separated God.
Absolutely. And that's why I say I'm not the judge. And I'll leave that to God. All I have is what's in front of me. And I think the lesson for us is this. Because we brought up Peter a couple times. Peter could have done the same thing Judas did. Peter could have allowed himself to be so overcome with worldly sorrow that he gave up and took the coward's way out, to use that phrase. But Peter, we give Peter a hard time too about, Peter always putting his foot in his mouth and what that. But the fact is, man, how much strength did it take for Peter to go from being the one to deny Christ to being the one who pronounced Christ on the day of Pentecost? Just a few days later, 40 days later, right?
He took accountability for what his
And that's a good point. He takes accountability. So the lesson, I think, for us here, let's move away from the mental health issue that Judas may or may not have had. The reality is, we all sin and continue to fall short of God's glory. Right? Barring mental health issues, we have a choice. We can either take the coward's way out and give up. And when I say give up, I don't mean just commit suicide. I mean, there are a lot of people that have given up on Christ and walked with him no more. We just read that last week, didn't we? There were those who decided they weren't going to follow Jesus anymore.
Spiritual suicide.
There you go. Or we can be like Peter and we can allow that godly sorrow to bring us to a point to proclaim God again in our lives. The question is, which way will we take? Is God giving us free will? Now, so I have the free will. I sinned. I fell short. I can either throw my hands up and go, well, you know what? I've been fighting this temptation and this sin all my life. I keep giving into it. I just can't do it anymore. I'm just going to give myself over to it. I'm just going to live like the world lives. To me, that's the coward's way out. Anybody can do that. Everybody does do that. The world does that, don't they? What would be easier? To humble ourselves and ask God for forgiveness and work on ourselves to be better today than I was yesterday, or to just give up, go out here and live like everybody else does? Which would be easier? So which way are we going to choose? Sure it is. Nothing in life worthwhile is easy. Is this worthwhile? Thanks, Clint. I didn't plan on going anywhere where we went today. It was Melvin brought that up. Melvin, I said easy questions. Phil's got a break today. He hadn't had to ask anything. All right, any other thoughts? Well, we're done. Whew! How far did we get? Verse 7. We'll pick up there next week, and I'll come back with hey, that's less work that I have to do for next Sunday. All right. Thank you all for a good discussion. I appreciate it.